Well, hello. Happy Wednesday, everyone. Everyone can hear me hopefully okay. I'm using my headphones, but I will get us started right away. I know we have a small group tonight, but it's obviously summer and a number of people sent their regrets, but also sent some thoughts and ideas that we could use for discussion points. So they shared that with me to bring up in the group, even though they couldn't be here and Zoom in person. And Sheila, I know you just sent me a note saying that you're making dinner. So thank you so much for taking time out and cooking dinner while joining with us. So before we jump in and I hear from you guys, I just a couple housekeeping items. I want to update you guys on a couple things. I obviously have an agenda up on the screen. But as you guys know, I want this to be informal. I want you guys to speak whenever you want. But it does just go over some of the things I'll be hitting on today. And although it may not be completely necessary, I do always love a good PowerPoint. So I'll go through this real quick. Again, just a couple housekeeping items. So just remember, everyone's here for the right reasons. We all want to improve education for kids around our state. So be respectful of everyone's opinions. Obviously, you guys are a group E. We've had 4 of our other smaller groups earlier this week. So excited to be with you guys. The share drive is still up. So that went out in the email that you guys should have received on Friday. So there's links to all the share drives for your group, but also for the other groups. Some of the links are the same. But there's a lot of also individual ones that people from different groups dropped in there. So feel free to check out the other shared drives for the other groups as well. All the summaries pages for our first 2 meetings or the last 2 meetings are up on the website. Also went out in that email. I'll do another summary for today and that will be up on the website. All the recordings are also up on the website. It went out so you guys can review or go back if you weren't able to join us. So one of the newer housekeeping items that I wanted to discuss with you guys is a survey. So I will be sending out a survey to help improve working groups like this or other working groups OPI might be doing in the future to kind of get your guys' feedback. Since this is the first time we've done something like this, we obviously want to improve it as much as we can going forward. The second thing is where I really want your guys' feedback to actually build the survey. So some of the feedback I got in the groups is we would like to get even a bigger kind of view of the community and what the priorities and concerns are there. So I would really like your guys' feedback on what type of questions we should ask. So for instance, when we're talking in the special ed group, what is the most or what is the area of most concern for you in, special education? List out the top 6 things that maybe the group listed to kind of get some numbers and some feedback. And what I request of you guys is one, to take that survey after you help me build it, but then push it out to your community. So either, in your school district, your friends, your families, neighbors, just so we can get as big as response back from the community as possible. So just keep that in the back of your mind as we discuss today. If you think of a good question we should include in the survey, please let me know either on here or I'll be building the survey over the next 2 weeks. So over the next 2 weeks, if anything pops your mind, shoot me an email, even if it's not fully formed, but it's just I feel like we should get more information on this. We could work together to formulate a question. So just keep that in your mind today and over the next 2 weeks. The other thing is the white paper. So I see the 2 main purposes to the white paper. One is obviously to take all of your priorities and concerns and bolster that with research and data and present that to the legislative committee. The other thing is I really see this as a living document, as a conversation starter, that it's not just something that we just give it to the legislature, but that we use it to continue the conversation of how we want to see education improved in the state. And another thing that has, I think, popped up in a lot of the groups is not just legislative fixes, but how we as a community come together to improve certain things. So I think there's a lot of good conversation things that are coming out of our discussions here that will be included in the white paper, and we can continue to discuss that as a community amongst ourselves and with the legislature. The white paper, I am basing it off all our discussions here, off the summary pages. I will be drafting that up over the next couple weeks. Mid-August, I will be sending that out to you, all the members of the Education Budget Working Group, to just review, to make sure I didn't miss anything that is really important to you. But also, I'm sure you'll think of things over the next couple weeks too, that, oh, we should build this out more, include this. So that will be going out as a draft in mid-August for you guys to review, give feedback before we finalize it for September. So that's kind of the quick overview, the housekeeping things. I am going to bring up our summaries. And like I said, we had our May summary from the last time, and now we have our June summary. So I'll leave the June summary up in the background for now as a shared screen, and we can use that to say, ooh, what else should we talk about? What did we miss last time? What do we want to expand on, dig in deeper? Think about the pros and cons too. That's something a lot of the groups have been expanding upon in this last kind of round of meetings, is we put a lot of ideas out there, but we also need to weigh the pros and cons. Whenever you're looking at reconfiguring the formula, a lot of people talk about how confusing it is, but then a lot of the things we talk about also break down the formula and make it possibly a little bit more difficult for people to understand, but may respond to the needs of the community better. So those are the types of pros and cons things that people are talking about. So now I am going to stop talking, and I would love to hear from you guys. And I can obviously kick off with a topic that some of other people emailed me, but I would love to, since you guys are here, I would love to kick it off to you and see if you have any thoughts from the last meeting. If you got to review the summary, if there's anything that's missing in the summary or anything that you would like to start today off with. I know Sheila's cooking dinner, so I may call on Ben or Brittany before Sheila.
I was just going to say that at this point, I want to be able to go back and I haven't had a chance yet to read all the other groups' recommendations. But it seems like we should really be thinking about boiling those down to a limited number, because it's my experience that if you go to the legislature with a big laundry list, you just don't get anywhere. It seems like we're going to have priorities and really have the research and the data and the community buy-in for what those priorities are. And you can have a long list and just say, this year we're going to work on these ones. That's one of the big disappointments about a biennial legislature, is that it takes so long to get through a list of things. But I just don't have the experience with the legislature that they work on lengthy lists of to-dos.
I've seen it be successful both ways. I think there's certain things that will definitely be in the front of the white paper that have been consistent, that literally every single group has brought up. But we will be also including across the board things to make sure that everyone's diversity of ideas are put out there. Like I said, I do think this is just a good discussion point, and sometimes there's no right one answer to something, and there's a lot of little pieces that come to this. But I definitely understand your concerns, and that's why I think one of the reasons why I'm also building the survey and building in some of that data is the survey, I think, will really help highlight those really top priorities. So it builds upon our discussion points to put that where the community is behind it, and show like, yes, there's these big swath of things that people care about. However, when we talk to the community, these are the top things that always come to the forefront. And obviously, the first thing on our page right here is the first thing that every single group talks about, and that's teacher retention and recruitment, and specifically, teacher compensation and teacher benefits. So that's obviously going to be a top thing in the white paper, because it was a top thing for all of you guys.
So I apologize in advance for not being very engaged as I should have been on some of the earlier meetings, but I'm definitely in agreement, and I have checked some of the notes on that being a top point there, and having those bullets underneath it. Was there any prior discussion around a statewide salary schedule like some of our neighbors have, and continue to outperform us in how they pay their teachers, and also have very similar legislatures to ours?
Yes, I don't think we discussed it in this group, but the previous group. So one example that was brought up recently, Iowa passed a statewide base teacher salary. So that's something Iowa recently did. Another thing brought up from another state, it wasn't necessarily a statewide base salary cap, but it was a statewide incentive for new teachers. It was a sign-on bonus. So in Oklahoma,
Mhm.
and I may get the exact numbers off, but it was like a $10,000 sign-on bonus if you were an in-state person. And then if you were an out-of-state person with a teacher's license, they were actually giving them $20,000 sign-on bonuses. So not exactly what you're saying, but those are two examples that happened very recently in other states.
Okay. And I've always looked, I guess, just in all my time in education in Montana, I've always looked at Idaho's statewide salary schedule, and not just starting schedule, but statewide everything, with much jealousy. I think they've got it really figured out for one of our neighboring states. I think they do it well.
And that was something, like I said, talked about in other groups, and some of the pros and cons weighed was, Montana is an exceptionally locally controlled state for education. So we don't have those kind of statewide things like that. So people were talking about the pros and cons of that. But I see, right? So anyone have
Yeah,
any?
and Idaho, yeah, yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No, that you go ahead.
Oh, Idaho probably has even more local control than Montana does. And so anyways, I'm not trying to overstate theirs. I just, they're just a, very, very, conservative legislature, conservative set of values, and are paying their teachers way better. The value of a statewide salary schedule is just so valuable, and it prevents, it takes away that decision factor of somebody maybe liking where they're at, but somewhere down the road pays a few $100s more type of thing. And in their model, if a district wants to levy their community, if they want to add to it, they're welcome to, but nobody can pay less than the statewide schedule because the state provides it.
Mm-hmm.
It's a good model.
And Brittany, I think, oh, yep, I think you were about
Yep.
to say something.
Well, I was going to ask Katie and Ben this question for you too. Do you know of anybody that also includes their classified? Like, we're having a really hard time recruiting even like paraprofessionals and cooks, and I'm sure it depends community to community, but like our HR people at our hospital are making over $30 an hour, and I don't make $30 an hour. And so it's just interesting, I guess, classified wise, what that recruitment looks like too. I think so much we spend on the teachers, which is a huge part of it. But we can't survive without our paras, our cooks, our custodians, and we just can't keep up to compete with the banks and the hospitals and the county and everything else. I'd be curious if there's any states that do that for their classifieds too.
That is a great question. I'm honestly unsure, but I can definitely look into that.
I would agree with what you're saying with where I'm at too in Montana. So great question. I know I went on and on about the Idaho model, and I was with the Department of Education in Idaho for 4 years. I guess I should have mentioned that, but that was not part of it there. So to answer your question, no, it did not cover classified.
In my experience, I've worked in a handful of states. It hasn't been, but I don't want to say end all be all because I'm not sure. Like, I'm not sure if Indiana has it, for instance, but so I can double check into that. But in my experience in other states, including like very different states in Montana or similar states, I haven't run into a state that has that. But that was also something raised in another group too, was that, like, obviously teacher retention gets a lot of discussion, but talking about also those other support individuals in the school, the turnover there. There's also high turnover in clerks as well, which also adds headache for administrative and reporting requirements. So I think looking at the overall like turnover and how we retain people in the education field, not just teachers, is an important thing to dig further into.
Well, I guess my thought on it, Katie, is if you can retain your staff, whether it be administration, clerks, teachers, paraprofessionals, whatever that looks like, it makes your building more consistent. And I know we're in the programs and curriculum group, and I think it allows you to actually implement and sustain some of those programs. I think it all starts from retention, no matter what position you're in. And I think it kind of ties probably into all the groups. Once you do that, then you can actually start your after school programs and have them be successful. And you can start your higher achievement programs and your honors and your, but like for us, every time we'd start something, that person would leave and we would have to start all over again. And so I feel like retention, when you're talking to somebody else talked about where do you start, you know, what's the one priority or a couple priorities you take to legislation? To me, that's pretty big because it ties into about everything else. It just creates the flow for every program that we're trying to make successful in our school for our kids.
And I think speaking to what you just said and what also Sheila said about having that information for the legislature to kind of grasp what everyone's talking about. One of the things that was brought up in previous groups, and I think Tamara, I think we talked about it a little bit, possibly in your group, was looking further into or asking the legislature to investigate certain things. So one of those that we've talked about previously was looking further into unfunded mandates. But another thing that we talked about is the costs of the turnover. So we don't really, I think, have a good picture of what it costs to, like, once a teacher or any of those individuals that we just left, what is the cost to the school to not have that person or other people picking up those tasks, but also the cost of just recruiting and finding that other person, training that person. It's all time and resources. So I think that would be something really good to look into to try to get further information on that we don't have a lot on, is an analysis of that cost. Because once you can see that, then if we invest more upfront, we don't have all these other costs of recruiting and bringing someone in and training them. And so I think that's sometimes an aspect that we lose, and it's a very good argument. Sorry to call you out, Tamara, but I think those are some things we touched on previously.
That's okay. And sorry I was late. I'm at a conference and juggling stuff and didn't quite get on in time.
Well, thank you so much for joining. I know I appreciate you joining from the conference. That is awesome.
No problem.
But also, like, thinking along those lines of those two things I said, we can think about other things that maybe we don't have the information on. Maybe we can't, we haven't gathered that yet or done a deep dive on it. And those are things we can ask the legislature to do that are smaller things, but will give us a bigger picture, a better picture of how we can improve things going forward.
Katie, do you have the ability to pull any numbers on costs of recruiting? I know
that's what I'm saying. We don't, and that's I think that's something we need to we have anecdotal, but we don't have those hard numbers. So I'm thinking that's something that, that might be a good thing to dig in further and gather more data on that.
I agree. And because I know that in the past, we were just inundated with applicants. And I think that was true for businesses as well as schools. Now, I'm talking to people that are spending, $1,500 and $2,000 just running ads on Indeed to find people. So when you think about what a school district has to go through in terms of, recruiting and background checking and everything else, there should be a way to come up with that number. And there might even be a way that someone has already done the research on the national basis, and we should check on that and see what it is, because it's going to be high. I also wanted to ask, somebody had mentioned that one of the other states had just started paying bonuses to new teachers, but they were doubling the bonuses for teachers from out of state. And I wondered how that would play with your local teachers. Because I know when hospitals started hiring traveling nurses for 2 to 4 times what they were paying their own staffs, it didn't go over well.
That is a great point. So Oklahoma just launched that program. So I don't have any information from Oklahoma to say, you know, this was the feedback from the community, this was the pushback or whatever. But that is a great point. And that's why we talk about the pros and cons. I think that's especially maybe sensitive in Montana, and it might be more sensitive than it was in Oklahoma. So that's why we need to weigh those pros and cons and look at other states and see, you know, we can look in a year or two at Oklahoma and see how beneficial that was. But we can also analyze it and look at it and see if it fits possibly into something in a different format. But it's like I said, interesting to look at what other states are doing.
I can speak a little bit on the payments. We posted on Indeed this spring, and I think our 1 month of ads was $400 to $500. All out of the country applicants, not a single American applied, and so we pulled it just because we were kind of in a time crunch where hiring a Filipino or another non-native was going to not be feasible for us. And I will say, administrative wise, I know MTSBA or Cal of the Law, a lot of those are 7,500 to 10,000 for a superintendent. And we're close enough to South Dakota. I even called them, and they're around the same pricing. And it's pretty expensive, and even to travel or buy a booth or do any of those things, you're talking probably $500 to $1,000 every trip. And so it definitely adds up. I'd be curious to see what the average per school is, especially rural. It's a little different when you live maybe big city, not to travel as far, but I can definitely add it pretty quick.
Yeah. And that's why I think having a better picture of that, because if you find out that, and it's not just like what you're talking about is like the tangible cost, like there's a bill, there's also the time cost, right? So those administrative staff have to spend hours of time trying to recruit someone that could be used for a lot of other ways to support the teachers. You know, so I think having a view of that, and if we know, oh wow, it costs an extra $10,000 of time and resources and everything to bring in someone, like if we use that money up front for salaries, for workplace improvements, for retention efforts, there might be a fiscal benefit at the end of it, which more money up front, but long-term savings. And that's what we would be looking for. Well, another thing that was brought up by a couple individuals, and I'm sorry, Tamara, because we're going to talk a couple of like repetitive things, but one group brought up, so for instance, the Indian Education for All funding is per pupil amount of money that the state or that the school gets to then provide that education services. They have to report then how they use that money to educate them. And they actually added some more teeth in the last session for that. But another group brought up having other funds that are like that to ensure that things don't get cut, right? So Indian education is a requirement in the state. They're funded to provide that. But there's other priorities too that people believe are really important for our students. Another group brought up, like I said, per pupil allocations for things like that, which I think play into this group in particular with, you know, curriculum and programs. So it was an interesting topic, although at the same time, people are talking about moving away from that kind of A and B per pupil allotment and going more towards a quality teacher-based payment. But what do you guys think about the pros and cons of having per pupil programmatic funding sources?
I think there can be some benefits there. The conference that I'm at is in Idaho, and at our board meeting today, they were talking about in Idaho, there are certain aspects of education where like numbers of special ed students or numbers of English language learner students, et cetera, like there's a little bit percentage increase that the school district gets from the state for some of those populations of students that require extra personnel, extra time and resources. Is that kind of what you're talking about?
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
but I mean, even more, I was thinking even like more specific than that, like, you know, you could say art is the most important thing in our community. We want a per pupil allotment, so to make sure that art classes. At the same time, we've also talked about in the previous groups there's been an increase of the English language learners, and that has been a stressor on schools too. They mentioned that the that kind of played into the unfunded mandates. They have to provide services to these students, but they're saying that the resources they're getting are not adequate to provide the services that are required by the state and the federal government.
Correct. Same would apply in my field of gifted ed.
Exactly. Because I was talking about your gifted ed in another group, and then someone was like, same thing for the English language learners too. So
Yes. Yeah. So in Idaho, they already have it for some of those things. Gifted isn't on the list, and they're trying to get it on the list in Idaho. Yeah.
because currently in Montana, schools do get extra money for those student population, but it's not necessarily always based on like, well, for instance, other states do a little bit more per pupil funding for special education. They don't actually calculate the actual number of special education students in the school, and they do it based on the likely percentage of special education students. But so there you can do it on the percentage, you can do it on the actual per pupil, you can do it in a chunk. But there were some people talking about how they really like the per pupil for more of those programmatic things.
Mm-hmm. Although the same thing comes up that I know we've talked about how like with A and B, you still need one teacher for 15 students and 22 students, but you get less A and B for the 15 students. So, I mean, in a way I get the per pupil, but when those numbers are smaller, you still need the same level of cost of resources, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, you're right. There's pros and cons to everything, right? That's why it's hard.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the only way I can like that notion or have seen it have some success is as long as there's a baseline for exactly the reason that was said. So if it's purely per pupil, I wouldn't be in favor of that. But if there's a base amount and then schools, because of local interest, wanted to add to that and say, okay, there's 12 programs and we can pick 2 that we want to, add more to because they're valuable in our community and get more per pupil. I mean, that could be an interesting model. But I think there's really got to be a base there to make it functional.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that I think is interesting is, and I appreciate that we get some money for extracurriculars, but I don't really feel like extracurriculars, whether it be, FFA or FCCLA or sports, whatever it is, I don't feel like that's tied to the current A and B. We don't really get money for them to be in those extracurriculars or sports, but now our homeschool kids can come in and we get money for that. It's almost like they've sectioned them off and classified and done that differently. So it is interesting when you say to talk about the per pupil and per program, what that could possibly look like. But I agree with Ben, there has to be a baseline somewhere if that's where they're looking to go.
And
I
guess
I agree.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I agree. And one of the problems that we have with the per pupil is also, while it makes it difficult for smaller districts, doing a baseline is also part of the problem. The reason we have so many districts to start with, we have some really small districts in the state, but because of local control, they have not wanted to consolidate. And there are efficiencies that happen when you consolidate, but in Montana, that also means some hard choices about travel time and about students being at school in their own neighborhoods and communities and so forth. So those are really thorny problems, and I don't think they're going to get worked out in the few months that we have before the legislature convenes again. And that's one of the things that I'm looking at, is that the little amount of time that we have before the legislature starts really should be spent on bolstering the arguments for the top few. And I'm starting to sound like a broken record for the top few things. And I think that AB thing is just not, it's too big a problem to solve in a couple of months and then go to the legislature with something really solid. because it requires a lot of buy-in on both big and small districts. And that's been the push and pull of the distraction the whole time, is that what benefits the biggest districts often hurts the smallest ones.
And there is like a pretty flushed out proposal that does, that was presented at the Constitutional Players convening by Lance Melton. And that proposal, there's quite a bit to it. And I'll make sure, if it's not in our shared drive, I'll make sure it's in our shared drive for you to review. But it was something that was proposed, so it's always good to look at. But that proposal did dive into weighting a quality educator payment higher, and having less reliance on A and B. So what you're talking about there. But I very much understand like that the priorities. And so let's dig into more of kind of some of the things that were discussed in the committees. So you kind of have a better sense of maybe where the committee's going and where you can be like, yeah, that's something, or oh, I don't know about that. So one of the things that was brought up in other groups, it was also discussed a little bit in the committee hearing, but I don't know, the temperature of the legislators necessarily. But there's obviously been acute pressures from inflation. And there were some people advocating for using a kind of just one-time backfill. Doesn't solve the long-term problems, but a one-time backfill with some of the surplus money that will be available, and providing that to schools to try to mitigate some of the inflationary pressures. Like I said, not a long-term fix, but it's a one-time thing to try to solve the immediate concerns. Any thoughts, anyone?
Wasn't that proposed in the 23 legislature, Katie?
I believe yes, there's been efforts to use surplus money for education. And some of the surplus money was used for that healthcare pool that was that we don't have kind of information yet. We don't have the impacts yet, but some of the surplus money was used for that pot. But I know it was bandied about recently so something to reconsider, revisit as a stopgap measure.
Is this what Lance and Montana Quality Education Coalition and SAM and that stuff's talking about?
That was the first thing I was talking about. Sorry, I might have confused. It was two separate things. So
no, I've heard Lance's proposal on raising the quality educator payment, but isn't there a broader group we're talking about some stuff too? No, just OPI.
There are groups and discussions happening. So Lance did present that at the Constitutional Players, which brought together like OPI, the governor, like the constitutional authorities, and some of those outside organizations as well. So are you talking about that meeting?
No, well, no, I wasn't at that. I heard Lance presented at a MTSBA thing, but gotcha. I thought there was the Quality Educators Coalition that was also working on talking about something with surplus money.
There's a number of organizations out there, and there has been a large focus, not just by Lance Melton, but what you said, I think across the board, and looking at the quality educator payment, bolstering that in a number of different ways, increasing that payment, increasing the eligibility. So some of those proposals were included in Lance Melton things, but then there's also been different entities and individuals talking about maybe just like parts of or pieces of that that proposal that Lance Melton gave. Does that make sense?
Sure. Thank you.
That wasn't a convincing sure, was it? But no, I think that's why I said the teacher retention and recruitment and the quality educator payment has been a huge topic of discussion, I think, across the board.
So, like on what's on the screen right now, are the five of us on this call are our thoughts and notes then reflecting that, or are we just kind of talking?
Well, I'm trying to get your reflection on those things. So that's what I'm trying to do. I mean, throughout the groups, basically, I'm collecting ideas and I'm weighing the temperatures on the proposals out there, but also taking in ideas that are proposals that haven't been discussed. So using examples from like Idaho. This is just an outline. The white paper will be much more fleshed out, but the purpose of this is to gather feedback from the community and pass that along to the legislature.
Okay, gotcha. Okay. I just didn't know if these bullets come back updated at a following meeting, or kind of what that looks like.
Oh, yeah. So the white paper is going to be a much more formalized thing. This is for purposes of our discussion and tracking, right? So these are the things that the group brought up last time, not completely fleshed out, right? I mean, you can read through this in 30 seconds
Yes.
versus an hour-long discussion. All of the
Right.
meetings are recorded for me to refer back to, including gathering different data, stats, and things that other individuals find interesting beyond what I gather based on questions from you guys too. The white paper will not be as top, or it's going to go into more detail on this based on our conversations, based on information that you and other individuals have emailed me, all of that. This is to
Okay.
help reflect, like there's some of you that are on every meeting and there's some of you that are only on one meeting.
Sure.
This is just so you can see where the group what the group talked about last time.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Katie, I was reading a bunch of summaries from other groups and maybe I missed it. What happened in Tennessee? Looks like a lot of people referencing Tennessee.
So Tennessee did a full overhaul, like completely reconfigured their funding formula. And I was trying to see if people kind of liked kind of what they did. There wasn't too much feedback because it's relatively new. So we're still seeing like how it's playing out, but it has been getting positive kind of feedback from in Tennessee. So people were wanting to look at that, but no one really dug too far into it or gave me too much feedback on how they were feeling on it. But I can happily send you over like I can send you, there's like a top line, it's not a one pager, it's more than one page, but it's not that many pages that Tennessee put out that I can put in our shared drive.
Okay.
And I would go into some more details, but I want to make sure I don't misspeak because I know I've mentioned a couple states and how they've done reforms, so I don't want to combine anyone. I know Missouri, for instance, did do some reforms, and other groups have talked about like some behavioral challenges in the schools now. And Missouri just implemented some behavioral like health funding to have behavioral interventionists in schools and stuff like that. So just want to make sure I don't confuse any of the reforms between the states.
Has there been any
one pager.
On the topic of teacher pay? Has there been any talk about what New Mexico did a few years ago? Bumped everything up to 50,000 and then have three levels basically on their pay scale, and what that and they've got some immediate data now, I guess, showing how they're definitely not bleeding teachers. People are definitely staying.
No one's brought up the New Mexico example in particular, but what you're talking about, people have brought up of having that baseline base pay to bring teachers in. But we also talked about how the highest turnover is for the first year teachers. But when you also look at the 3 to 5 year teachers, it's only a couple percentage better. They still have an incredibly high turnover. So one of the things brought up was ensuring that not just that base pay is addressed, but that that pay is not just pay, but workplace environment, support, all of that continues throughout the teacher's like career. So they want to maintain it as a career. So that was brought up, I think, more abstractly than specifically the New Mexico example.
Okay.
But do you so you were positive about how New Mexico's reforms worked out?
Well, I think it's probably in its third-ish year right now, third, maybe going into 4, but they've seen it keep people in the classroom like that they saw that out the get-go. I don't know if you can make huge conclusions about anything after 3 years. I know teachers there. I know state education folks there, and folks are certainly positive about that. But again, it's money that comes from the state. They didn't tell local school districts, pay your teachers 50,000, and you're going to have to figure out how to do it. The state completely stepped in and said there's 3 levels of teacher pay, A, B, and C, or 1, 2, 3. I don't know what they call them. And then those go up with cost of living and different things each year. They're not static, but I know they're starting everybody out at 50,000.
And just talking about building and cost of living increases in a more formalized way has also been brought up in groups, especially with inflation. So obviously the cost of living is acutely felt right now. And I'm not as familiar with New Mexico. And you said, how are the 3 tiers broken down by? And I could check it out afterwards, but if you do off the top of your head.
Yeah, I like what, well, beginning entry into the profession is 1. I don't know if a master's is 2. I'm not sure what advances a person from 1 to 2 and 2 to 3. Yeah, so
I was wondering if it was if it was based on years with a combination of, degrees or whatever, but I'll check into it. And if I find a good summary, I'll make sure I throw that in there into the share drive as well.
Sure. Yeah,
I haven't dug into that specific thing in New Mexico. So thank you for bringing that to my attention.
You bet. It would definitely be a radical thought in Montana. The Idaho traditional steps and lanes that are all supported and funded by the state would be probably a lot more palatable, or a lot closer to what we do. They just don't have the varying. Every school district doesn't have their own steps and lanes that are different than their neighbor there, so it'd be more like what we do.
And you just talking about base pay, another thing that was brought up, and this, this may be pie in the sky, but before I go into this, I just want to say one thing. I know, and Chile brought this up, I know it can be very frustrating when you're trying to look for change and change doesn't happen overnight. And sometimes you talk about big things, you're like, oh, I can't foresee this happening in this legislature. I am a firm believer that's not a reason why you shouldn't talk about it. You should continue to talk about creative ideas, big ideas. In a previous role, I worked in Congress as a staffer in DC. I worked on the Hill for about 10 years. And in that time, like my first year, I saw things that I was like, there's no chance that this is ever going to happen. And it passed and was signed into law before I left. So I would say don't get discouraged. I know it can be hard because things take time, and sometimes it's like, this shouldn't take this much time, but also stay positive that talking about these big ideas and big reforms can still have really meaningful outcomes. So it can be frustrating, but stay positive. But what I was going to go into, which is a little bit more pie in the sky, but another group brought up, ties into base pay, but so the base budget, and people have talked about having the state responsible for the entire base budget, and then it's up to the schools. They remove the max budget limits, and then it'd be up to the school districts then to expand upon, levy, whatever, what they want beyond the base level that's provided by the state. Now, that's still coming from like tax dollars some way, right? So it's still coming from the people, but it does shift kind of some of that burden, some of the reliance on levies that people have talked about. So just a thought.
Katie, do you know anything on, I know at one point they talked about doing a cost analysis of schools. This is before we got into a lot of this extra funding stuff. Are they still going to do that?
I know they have been doing some models on higher education and stuff like that. So let me just check on what models they were doing for the cost analysis, because I know they have been doing.
Okay. I guess my question was, and as we continue to talk about funding, whether it be with teacher retention or, unfunded mandates, whatever that is, I think that what all they're considering in their cost analysis needs to be addressed before they do it. If they're expecting us to, example for me is to pay for an audit every year, that's part of the process, but it's not included in that cost analysis. It's really hard to determine if they're funding us properly or how they could fund us better. And so I think that goes across the board with teacher pay, the unfunded mandates, everything that we've talked about.
And I do think having a deeper dive into even the smaller things like those unfunded or underfunded mandates to identify the requirements the schools are having to do, but are the resources equated to the requirements and across the board. Obviously, we talked about that with gifted and talented with Tamara, but there's things that we don't think of on a day-to-day basis, like you said, an audit. So I think it's important to do, like you said, make sure that those things are taken into account. Someone also brought up consolidation earlier, and there was a lot of groups have brought up consolidation in two different ways, consolidation within just consolidating schools. But there was another gentleman who brought up, and he actually did his own analysis because he works in in this field for his school, and he's really great at finances. And it wasn't actually getting rid of any of the schools, it was consolidating the school districts in that area. So it was basically two more suburban and a more like urban in Montana terms areas. And he was looking at if we annex those two schools that are, a couple miles apart, barely, and just for the administrative oversight, that would save administrative money that could then go be redirected possibly to teachers or whatever. So he was looking at it from not getting rid of any schools, but just condensing the administrative. So not keeping the same amount of schools, but condensing the actual school districts.
I love that idea, Katie. I think that would be a much more palatable step for the small schools because they could combine purchasing, they could combine HR and administrative.
Yeah.
They could also share some of the resources between the schools that they can't share now. And especially when you're talking about adding those mental health components back into the schools, that really makes a lot of sense that you would be able to share those resources. It also kind of levels out that difference between the haves and the have-nots in terms of the urban and rural schools.
Yeah, I thought it was a very interesting idea, and he highlighted all those administrative costs. And some of the other groups they brought up, and I think we talked about it here, was being able to share specialized teachers. I knew when I was growing up, my music teacher was shared between two school districts. But it was in a different state, so it was not quite as complicated as it would be here. And one of the things that people brought up, it's like it would be really hard to share specialized teachers like that between school districts because of the differing pay scales and everything that goes, the healthcare policy, everything different between those. But like you said, having more combined districts would allow for more of the sharing of those specialized teachers between those schools.
So I'll sound like a broken record, but that was interesting. So you said it was somebody done their own private study that's here in Montana that is a district employee somewhere?
I mean, I wouldn't say it was a study like officially because he doesn't have like controls or whatever, but he was like, I was doing some math looking at this because he has experience
gotcha.
in it. So like, I don't know how, I can't say it's scientific. And he even said
Sure.
not perfect, but it was very interesting.
Well, and my broken record thing, and again, this comes from working for Board of Ed in Idaho, but so Idaho forced that but forced it from the legislature top down in maybe the late 90s, early 2000s, that if your school district was X size or smaller and you were within, Y number of miles radius to a neighbor, you had to combine administrations and combine school boards and do that. You got to keep your schools open. Kids still got to graduate with a Midvale or a Cambridge or a council diploma, but those three schools all might become one school district. And I think it's worked for them. I think that's long enough now a person could ask around and say, were there any unintended consequences? I think it worked for them.
Wyoming, North Dakota, I think most of the states out in the West have done some form of consolidation other than Montana. So
Right.
we have lots of examples to look at for that, actually.
Well, we did consolidation. We did the 3-year thing in the, what was it, the 2000s, where we had schools that could, if they combined, they could keep the funding for both for a while. But yeah, we haven't done it the same as others.
Yeah, that big, which can be jolting. And and I honestly, coming into these group, I thought even discussing this, I didn't think anyone was going to want to discuss it. And almost every single group has brought that up on their own, saying like, I know this is a difficult topic, but it's at least something we should visit and analyze and see if it's feasible. It might not be, like you said, it's not going to one size fits all. It might be feasible in some areas and not others.
Because especially with small communities, community identity is often so tied to the school, which is often the school district. I'm wondering if there's a way to call it something other than a district, like an umbrella co-op, or I don't know, like a resource sharing. If that might help make it a little bit more appealing to people who might otherwise be resistant because of that. Like I'm thinking, I'm up
You're
in
thinking of a
Folsom.
communications plan right there.
And I'm also thinking like some of these schools are often rivals. So
Yeah.
do they want to? Yeah. But there might be a way to still make it happen where it's not chipping away at that identity, which
And I
matters
know that
to
is very
small
important.
towns.
And Montana does have a really unique education culture, and it's really valued, and it's really amazing. I mean, Montana has the most one-room schoolhouses in the U.S. And so Montana's really unique in a really great way. But I think since all these groups brought it up, it seems like at the very least, looking at a way to do that so everyone feels as comfortable as possible and resources are shared in the best way possible. At least looking at it, it seems something that people are open to.
And I could see I'm gonna be the bad person in the room because I brought it up in this group last time. I could see doing it both ways depending on where you are. So in our county, we do have 3 country schools, 3 elementaries, 1 room schoolhouses that are K-8, and one of them we actually run a bus within 5 miles of. And so that is where part of me is thinking consolidation, not shared resources. Consolidation, they have 3 kids, but they have to have utilities, have a full-time staff person, have a part-time clerk, like you still have maintenance on your building, XYZ. But like I said, we're running 5 miles from there. And I could see where the shared resources, particularly in our county, would be difficult. You're asking either your administrator or someone to travel at least 70 miles round trip every day. And granted, we ask the kids to do that also, which who are you better off asking to get in a car and go? But then you're talking about extended work hours and higher salary. And I feel like there's just a lot of things that play into both of them. But I think it's, like you said, I don't think it's a one size fits all, because I could see where both would be useful. We're at my situation currently, we're pretty far to share resources. Like I said, I do feel like consolidating would be a thought, even though, like I said, that's not a popular opinion. But I think it's a ways for us to be within 5 miles of the school and not bring those kids with us and have, I don't want to say wasted money, but that money can be used somewhere else in the state or within our current schools.
Yeah. Well,
I
like
agree.
said, maybe it's not
I
one size
agree.
fits all, and there might be, but it sounds like everyone's in agreement that we should at least look at it and see how it could be beneficial to everyone. because it might be hard what you're looking at with consolidating school, but maybe those students get a lot more benefits and they have a lot more access to, different resources at that larger school. So there's always pros and cons, like I said from the beginning. So
Yep.
we're running out of time here. So Sheila, it looks like you're about to say something, so go ahead.
I just was going to say our short list now includes teacher retention and looking at ways to either consolidate or share resources between districts in order to save money and improve educational outcomes.
Now that was a perfect sentence. Like that was just to give you, I was like, that sounded like you prepared that in a speech there. That was pretty good.
I do a lot of writing in my job. So yeah, I just think, again, I'm ultra focused on giving the legislators as few decisions to make as possible, so they don't get decision fatigue and just start saying no to everything.
I totally understand where you're coming from that. So, and just to it sounds like your two top priorities, are those your two top priorities?
I think my number one priority is more school funding, period, and then retention, and then consolidation or shared resources.
Well, I want to be respectful of everyone's time. I know we're wrapping up here. So if anyone has any last thoughts, please go ahead. But like I said, keep in mind, keep an eye out for the white paper that will come in mid-August. And then over the next 2 weeks, when we've talked about some ideas here that I think may be beneficial to get some community feedback on. And I'm going to ask you guys when we get this survey out there to push it to as many people as possible so we get as many answers as possible. But keep that survey in your mind and shoot me an email anytime over the next 2 weeks if you have any thoughts for me to kind of build into there. Otherwise, I will post this video tomorrow for anyone to review, and the summary will be coming shortly after that. And if you think of anything else in the meantime, my door is always open. Just shoot me an email. So if there's no parting thoughts.
Thank you for all your hard work with this.
Oh, what?
Thank you for all of your hard work with this. This has been like, the more I've observed and been a part of this, what a monumental task you've been placed with. And it's appreciated. So I can tell that there's been a lot going on behind the scenes too. So anyway, thank you.
Ditto.
Thank you. That's very nice. I appreciate you. You guys are taking time out of your personal lives and on a conference and cooking dinner to join. So that's awesome that you guys are so dedicated. And that's why I said everyone's here for the right reasons. We may have different opinions here or there, but we want a better education for our students. So better education for that guy right there. Well, thank you again, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your night. Please stay in contact with me and I will be sending you emails. So yeah, enjoy the rest of your night and stay cool.
Take care.